I spent years hiding my fortune behind tattered clothes and an old rattling subway card. My children thought I was worthless. My neighbors whispered about my pitiful state, and even my closest family ignored my existence. The truth was about to destroy them all. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning at 5:30, I dragged myself up from the creaky bed in my small Bronx apartment. The floorboards groaned under my feet like old bones. Peeling paint hung from the walls like dead skin, and the smell of last night's rain mixing with city grit clung to the air like a wet blanket. My reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed a woman of 72, gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing the same faded house dress I'd owned for 8 years. I would shuffle to the kitchen, stepping over the loose linoleum tile that curled up near the refrigerator. The coffee maker, a wedding gift from 47 years ago, wheezed and sputtered as it brewed my morning cup. Through the thin walls, I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door getting her grandchildren ready for school. Their laughter felt like a knife in my chest. My days were spent navigating the noise of New York's streets. The honking taxis created a symphony of urban chaos. The chatter of hurried passers-by mixed with distant screams of street vendors selling everything from hot dogs to knockoff designer bags. Construction workers jackhammered concrete somewhere nearby, the sound echoing off the canyon walls of apartment buildings. But inside my heart, I was silent, weighed down not just by age, but by the cold shoulders of those I once trusted. The subway card in my worn leather purse had exactly $12.37 left on it. I counted every trip, every transfer, stretching those dollars like they were my last. People on the train would glance at me with that look. You know the one. Pity mixed with fear that they might end up like me someday. A forgotten old woman in clothes that had seen better decades. But they didn't know. None of them knew. Last October, I sent my daughter Sarah a simple text asking if we could meet for coffee. The message sat there with one gray check mark for 3 days. Then she finally responded, "Mom, I'm really busy with the kids right now." No suggestion for another time, no rain check, just a polite dismissal wrapped in maternal responsibility. Another birthday passed in November, 72 years on this earth, and not a single card arrived in my mailbox. No phone calls, no flowers. I sat in my threadbare armchair, the one with the spring that poked through the left cushion, and ate a slice of store-bought cake by myself. The vanilla frosting tasted like cardboard, but I finished every bite because wasting food felt like a sin I couldn't afford. I smiled sadly, remembering happier times. In my wallet, tucked behind my expired library card, was a faded photo from our family vacation to the Catskills in 1991. Sarah was 16 then, all braces and attitude. Michael was 14, his arms slung around my shoulders like I was the coolest mom in the world. We were standing in front of a rented cabin, pine trees stretching toward a perfect blue sky. Everyone was laughing at something David, my late husband, had just said. His eyes crinkled with joy behind wire-rimmed glasses. That photo lived in my wallet for 33 years. Some nights I'd take it out and trace their faces with my fingertip, wondering when exactly I became invisible to them. When did I transform from the center of their universe into an obligation they couldn't wait to escape? Expectation told me they'd come running if I really needed them. Reality was a lonely echo in my empty kitchen every Sunday when other families gathered for dinner. I would set the table for one and pretend I preferred the solitude. The silence was easier than admitting how desperately I missed being needed. But let me tell you about the woman I used to be. The woman they chose to forget. For 45 years, I was the backbone of this family. When Sarah needed her college tuition paid, I worked double shifts at the diner on Roosevelt Avenue. My feet would swell so badly I had to soak them in ice water every night. But I never complained. Every dollar I earned went toward her education, business degree from NYU. Full ride, courtesy of her mother who believed in her dreams more than her own comfort. When Michael's first marriage fell apart, guess who paid for the divorce lawyer? $3,000 I didn't have, borrowed against my retirement savings. He promised to pay me back. That was 8 years ago. The promise evaporated like morning mist over the East River. When my grandson Tommy needed surgery for his appendix and Sarah's insurance wouldn't cover the full cost, I liquidated my emergency fund without hesitation. $7,000 handed over in cash because family comes first. Family always comes first. That's what I believed. That's what I lived by. David had been gone for 12 years now. Heart attack at 68, sudden as a thunderclap. One minute he was reading the daily news at the kitchen table, complaining about the Yankees' pitching rotation, and the next minute he was slumped over his coffee cup, gone forever. The funeral was packed with coworkers and neighbors, but even then, I noticed how quickly my children left afterward, how eagerly they returned to their own lives, leaving me to grieve alone. After David died, I became the family's unofficial caregiver. When Sarah's kids were sick, I took the subway 40 minutes to her house in Queens, carrying homemade chicken soup in a thermos. I'd stay all day, monitoring fevers, reading stories, doing laundry. Sometimes I'd sleep on their uncomfortable couch for 3 days straight until the crisis passed. Did Sarah ever thank me? She'd pat my shoulder absently while scrolling through her phone. "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver." But the words felt hollow, rehearsed, like lines from a play she'd performed too many times. Michael was worse. He had this way of making me feel guilty for existing. Christmas dinner at his house in Manhattan became an annual endurance test. I'd bring gifts for everyone, homemade cookies that took me days to bake, and conversation topics I'd practiced in the mirror. But within an hour, he'd start checking his watch and making comments about traffic. "Mom, you know what your problem is?" he said to me last Christmas, his voice sharp with irritation. "You think the world revolves around family dinners and birthday cards? Some of us have real responsibilities." I was standing in his gleaming kitchen, admiring the granite countertops that cost more than my annual rent, holding a plate of cookies that suddenly felt incredibly heavy. His wife Jennifer rolled her eyes and muttered something about emotional manipulation under her breath. Their teenage son didn't even look up from his phone. I wanted to remind Michael that I'd paid for this very apartment's down payment. That his real responsibilities were only possible because I'd sacrificed my own dreams, my own retirement security, to give him opportunities I never had. Instead, I swallowed the words like broken glass and smiled. "Of course, honey, I understand." But inside, something was beginning to crack. A tiny fissure in the foundation of my identity as a mother, a giver, a woman whose worth was measured by how much she could sacrifice for others. The manipulation creeps in slowly, like water through concrete. You don't notice it at first. It starts with small requests that seem reasonable. "Mom, could you watch the kids this weekend? We really need a break." Then it escalates. "Mom, we're having money troubles. Could you help us with rent this month?" The requests came with guilt attached like price tags. If I hesitated, even for a second, I became the selfish mother who didn't care about her family's well-being. If I said no, I was abandoning them in their time of need. But if I said yes, which I always did, I wasn't appreciated. I was expected, taken for granted like electricity or running water. I remember one particular phone call from Sarah in March of last year. She was crying, which immediately sent me into panic mode. "Mom, I don't know what we're going to do. The mortgage company is threatening foreclosure. We need $15,000 by Friday or we'll lose the house." $15,000. My entire remaining retirement fund. "Sarah, that's everything I have left," I whispered into the phone, my hand shaking. "I know it's a lot, Mom, but you're our only hope. The kids would be homeless. Your grandchildren would be on the street. Is that what you want?" The guilt hit me like a physical blow. I could see Tommy and little Emma with their backpacks and teddy bears standing on a sidewalk with nowhere to go. The image was so vivid, so heartbreaking, that I couldn't breathe properly. "Of course not, sweetheart. Let me make some calls." I liquidated my retirement account the next morning. Every penny I'd saved for my golden years dissolved in a single transaction. When the bank teller asked if I was sure, I nodded quickly before I could change my mind. The check was written. The money was gone. My security blanket, torn away. Sarah's relief was palpable when I handed her the cashier's check. She hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I promise we'll pay you back as soon as we can. You saved our lives." That promise was 10 months ago. Not a single payment. Not even a payment plan discussion. The topic became forbidden somehow, like mentioning a dead relative at a dinner party. Whenever I gently brought up the loan, Sarah's eyes would glaze over and she'd change the subject to the weather or her children's school activities. Meanwhile, I was eating pasta and canned sauce for dinner 5 nights a week because it was all I could afford. My arthritis medication was rationed because the copays were too expensive. I wore the same 4 outfits in rotation, washing them by hand in my kitchen sink to save money on the laundromat. But the worst part wasn't the financial strain. It was the slow realization that I had become invisible to the very people I'd shaped my entire identity around serving. Birthday after birthday passed unmarked. I stopped mentioning them because the disappointment was too crushing. Mother's Day became just another Sunday, watching other families walk past my window carrying flowers and cards, heading to brunch celebrations I was never invited to join. When I got bronchitis last winter and was bedridden for 2 weeks, I texted both children to let them know I was sick. Sarah responded with, "Feel better soon," followed by a prayer hands emoji. Michael didn't respond at all. Neither of them called to check on me. Neither offered to bring soup or medicine or even just sit with me for an hour. I lay in that bed, coughing until my ribs ached, staring at my phone and waiting for it to ring. Hours stretched into days. The silence was deafening. I realized that if something terrible happened to me, if I had a heart attack or stroke, I could lie on this floor for days before anyone noticed I was gone. The thought terrified me more than death itself. That's when the doubts really started creeping in. Late at night, when the city quieted to its softest hum, I'd lie awake wondering if I was just a wallet to them. A convenient source of emergency funds and free babysitting. An ATM that occasionally required maintenance in the form of quick visits and perfunctory phone calls. Was I being dramatic? Was this just how adult children behaved in the modern world? I'd watch other elderly people on the subway, some chatting excitedly on phones with grandchildren, others sitting alone with that same hollow look I saw in my own mirror. The lucky ones and the forgotten ones, sharing the same subway car but living in completely different universes. I tried to rationalize their behavior. Sarah had 2 children and a demanding job. Michael was climbing the corporate ladder and needed to focus on his career. They were busy. They were stressed. They were living their lives the way I'd raised them to do, independently and ambitiously. I should be proud, not resentful. But pride doesn't warm you when you're eating dinner alone for the 300th night in a row. Pride doesn't answer when you call just to hear another human voice say your name. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in January. I was sorting through old papers, organizing my sparse filing cabinet, when I found a folder I hadn't opened in years. Inside were documents from David's life insurance policy, bank statements from accounts I'd forgotten about, investment papers that had been gathering dust since his death. As I read through the papers, my hands began to shake. Not from age or arthritis, but from shock. David had been far more financially savvy than either of us had discussed. He'd invested wisely, saved secretly, and protected our future in ways I'd never fully understood. The life insurance payout had been substantial. The investments had grown steadily over 12 years of compound interest. There were savings accounts I'd never touched, CDs that had matured and rolled over, a small stock portfolio that had performed remarkably well during the market's recovery. I wasn't poor. I wasn't even close to poor. I was a woman of considerable means masquerading as a charity case in my own family's eyes. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I sank into my kitchen chair, papers scattered across the table, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The numbers didn't lie. I had been living like a pauper while sitting on a small fortune. I had been begging my children for respect and attention when I could have hired a housekeeper, taken vacations, lived like the comfortable widow I actually was. But why had I hidden this from myself? Why had I adopted this victim persona so completely that I'd even fooled my own reflection? The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking over the city skyline. I had been so afraid of being abandoned, so terrified of losing what little connection I had with my children, that I'd made myself smaller and smaller. I'd made myself useful rather than valued, necessary rather than loved. I'd confused being needed with being wanted. They thought I was helpless, so I'd become helpless. They assumed I was broke, so I'd lived like I was broke. They treated me like a burden, and I'd accepted that role because even negative attention felt better than no attention at all. My hands trembled as I reached for my cell phone and called the number on one of the investment statements. A polite woman named Jennifer answered and confirmed what the papers had told me. My total assets were worth just over $430,000. I was not a charity case. I was not dependent on my children's grudging assistance. I was a financially independent woman who had been playing the part of a desperate mother for so long that I'd forgotten it was just a performance. That afternoon, I walked to the mirror in my bedroom and really looked at myself for the first time in years. Not the quick glance while brushing my teeth or the hurried check before leaving the apartment. A real look, an honest assessment. I saw a woman who had shrunk herself to fit into spaces that were too small for her. I saw someone whose entire identity had become shaped by other people's expectations and dismissals. I saw a stranger wearing my face, someone I barely recognized. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I cooked myself a real dinner. Not pasta from a box or soup from a can, but actual ingredients assembled with care and intention. Salmon with herbs, roasted vegetables, a small glass of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion that never came. I set my table with the good dishes David and I had received as wedding gifts, the ones I'd been saving for family dinners that never happened. As I ate in the soft glow of my overhead light, I began to plan. Not just for tomorrow or next week, but for the rest of my life. For the first time in years, the future felt like a landscape of possibilities, rather than a narrow corridor leading nowhere. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this deception had grown. I needed to know what my children really thought of me, what they said when I wasn't around to hear it. I had a terrible suspicion that their neglect wasn't just carelessness. It was something much more calculated. The next few weeks became a fact-finding mission. I started paying closer attention to how they spoke to me, how they spoke about me, and most revealing of all, how they spoke to each other when they thought I couldn't hear. The breakthrough came during a visit to Sarah's house in February. I was babysitting Tommy and Emma while she and her husband went to a work function. The children were upstairs doing homework, and I was cleaning up the dinner dishes when Sarah's cell phone, forgotten on the counter, began buzzing with text messages. I wasn't trying to snoop. I was just moving the phone to charge it when I saw Michael's name on the screen. The preview of his message made my blood freeze. Is Mom still pretending to be broke? I'm tired of her guilt trips. My face burned with shame and anger. I set the phone down with shaking hands, but I couldn't stop looking at it. More messages appeared from Sarah. She's been useful for babysitting, but honestly, I wish she'd just move to one of those senior places and stop expecting us to entertain her. Michael's response came immediately. The martyr act is getting old. She acts like she's doing us favors, but she needs us more than we need her. At least she doesn't ask for money anymore. Sarah again. Thank God for that. Remember when she was always having quote-unquote emergencies? I felt bad for her, but it was getting ridiculous. Michael. She made her choices. She could have saved money instead of spoiling us when we were kids. Now she gets to live with the consequences. I stood in that gleaming kitchen, surrounded by appliances I'd helped pay for, reading messages that reduced my entire existence to an inconvenience. They weren't just neglecting me, they were actively dismissing me. They had turned my love into a joke, my sacrifices into character flaws, my loneliness into a personality defect. The children came downstairs asking for help with homework, and somehow I managed to function normally. I helped Emma with her math, listened to Tommy read a chapter from his book report, made them snacks, and tucked them into bed, all while my heart was breaking into pieces. When Sarah and her husband returned home, she thanked me absently and asked if I needed money for the subway, as if I were the hired babysitter instead of their grandmother, as if the subway fare were a generous tip rather than a basic courtesy. I rode home that night staring out the subway window at the dark tunnel walls, seeing my own reflection ghosted over the rushing blackness. I had been living in a tunnel for years, moving through darkness while pretending there might be light ahead if I just kept walking. But there was a light. I was carrying it with me. I'd been carrying it all along without realizing it. That weekend, I made an appointment with a financial advisor. Margaret Chen had been highly recommended by the investment company, and her office overlooked Central Park from the 32nd floor of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise. As I sat across from her polished desk, explaining my situation, I felt like I was describing someone else's life. "Mrs. Martinez," she said gently, "you've been living below the poverty line while sitting on assets that would make you very comfortable. May I ask why?" The question was so direct, so obvious, that I started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind that comes from recognizing an absurdity so profound it breaks your brain a little bit. "I honestly don't know," I said. "I think I was afraid that if I didn't need them, they wouldn't need me." Margaret nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen this pattern before. "It's more common than you'd think. People, especially women of your generation, sometimes equate their value with their usefulness. But Mrs. Martinez, your worth isn't determined by how much you can give away or how much others require from you." She showed me charts and projections, investment options and retirement scenarios. With proper management, my existing assets could generate enough annual income for me to live very comfortably without touching the principal. I could afford a better apartment, regular vacations, healthcare without rationing, restaurants and cultural events, and all the small luxuries I'd been denying myself for years. More importantly, I could afford independence. I could afford to say no. I could afford to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what others expected. Margaret helped me open new accounts, set up automatic investments, and most crucially, establish clear boundaries around my money. My assets would be protected from impulsive decisions, emotional manipulation, and financial emergencies that weren't actually my responsibility. Walking out of that office building, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The city looked different from the sidewalk outside, brighter, more welcoming. The spring air carried hints of possibility instead of just exhaust and disappointment. But I wasn't ready to reveal my discovery yet. I needed to understand the full scope of how I'd been perceived and treated. I needed to document the reality of my relationships with my children before I changed the dynamic forever. So I began keeping track. A journal of interactions, conversations, requests, and responses. When I called, how long did they talk to me? When they called, what did they want? How often was I invited to participate in their lives versus being asked to provide services for them? The pattern was stark and undeniable. In 6 weeks of careful record-keeping, Sarah contacted me 14 times. 12 of those calls were requests for babysitting. One was to ask if I had any old furniture she could have. The last was a group text about changing the time for Easter dinner by 2 hours, sent 90 minutes before the original time. Michael called me exactly 3 times in 6 weeks. Once to ask if I still had his high school yearbook. Once to tell me he'd be turning off his landline and I should only call his cell phone. The third call was to inform me that his family would be spending Thanksgiving with his in-laws this year, so I shouldn't expect them. Neither child asked how I was feeling. Neither inquired about my health, my loneliness, my needs, or my dreams. I had become a utility in their lives, like a tool they kept in storage until they needed it for a specific job. But the most painful discovery was how they spoke about me to others. Through a combination of overheard conversations and social media posts I wasn't supposed to see, I learned that I had become their example of how not to age. The cautionary tale they shared with friends about mothers who become too dependent, too needy, too emotionally demanding. Sarah had posted on Facebook about the importance of elderly parents maintaining their independence, using language that made it clear she was talking about me without naming me directly. Her friends responded with supportive comments about setting boundaries and not enabling codependent behavior. Michael had made jokes at a work happy hour about his high-maintenance mother, according to his wife's Instagram story. He'd described me as unable to manage my own life, constantly looking to her children for validation and support. They had created a narrative about me that justified their neglect. In their version of the story, I was pathetic and clingy. They were patient and generous. My loneliness was my fault for not building a more fulfilling, independent life. My financial struggles were the result of poor planning rather than decades of sacrificing for their benefit. This narrative allowed them to feel good about themselves while treating me poorly. It transformed my love into weakness, my generosity into manipulation, my grief over David's death into an inability to move forward independently. But narratives can be rewritten. Stories can have different endings, and I was about to give this story a twist that none of us saw coming. The plan formed slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. I would stop pretending to be poor, but I wouldn't announce my wealth either. Instead, I would gradually begin living according to my actual means and see how long it took them to notice. I would observe their reactions as their dependent, needy mother transformed into someone they couldn't categorize or control. The first change was my appearance. I made an appointment at a real salon for the first time in 8 years. The stylist, a young woman with purple highlights and kind eyes, asked what I had in mind. "I want to look like myself again," I said. "I want to look like the woman I was before I forgot who that was." She cut away years of neglect and self-imposed invisibility. My hair was styled in a way that flattered my face rather than hiding it. She taught me how to apply makeup that enhanced my features instead of trying to erase them. When she turned my chair toward the mirror, I saw someone I hadn't seen in over a decade. I saw Elena Martinez, not just Michael and Sarah's mother. The second change was my apartment. I hired a cleaning service and a handyman. The peeling paint was replaced with warm colors I actually liked. The broken linoleum was covered with attractive rugs. I bought plants and art and comfortable furniture that didn't apologize for taking up space. Most dramatically, I upgraded my phone to the latest model and set up social media accounts. If my children were going to talk about me online, I was going to be part of that conversation. The third change was my social life. I joined a book club at the community center near Central Park. I started taking a pottery class in Brooklyn Heights. I volunteered at a literacy program for adults learning English. For the first time in decades, I was meeting people who knew me as Elena, not as someone's exhausted mother or disappointing relative. These new friends were diverse and interesting. Maria was a retired teacher who traveled to different countries to volunteer at schools. James was a widower who had started painting at age 70 and was preparing for his first gallery show. Patricia was a former social worker who ran a small nonprofit helping elderly immigrants navigate healthcare systems. They invited me to dinners and cultural events. They asked for my opinions on books and current events. They remembered details about my life and followed up on conversations we'd had weeks earlier. They treated me like a complete person with her own thoughts, interests, and value. For months, I said nothing to Sarah or Michael about these changes. I was curious to see if they would notice that their helpless mother was transforming into someone else entirely. I was testing whether their neglect was based on genuine belief that I was pathetic, or whether they had willfully ignored who I really was. The first sign that they were paying attention came in July. Sarah called me on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual since she typically only called when she needed something. "Mom, Mrs. Rodriguez from your building mentioned that you've been looking really good lately. Are you feeling okay?" The question was strange. Was looking good a symptom of illness in their worldview? Was taking care of myself a cause for concern? "I'm feeling wonderful, Sarah. Better than I have in years." "That's great, Mom. It's just that Mrs. Rodriguez said you had workers in your apartment, and she was wondering if everything was okay financially. I told her you were managing okay, but if you need help with anything expensive like repairs..." She was fishing. Mrs. Rodriguez had probably mentioned the improvements to my apartment, and Sarah was trying to figure out how I could afford them. In their version of my story, unexpected expenses should trigger calls for financial assistance. "Oh, the apartment just needed some updating. Nothing major." I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain or justify or ask for their approval. The conversation felt different from our usual dynamic, less like a parent reporting to concerned children, and more like an adult woman choosing what to share with acquaintances. Michael noticed the changes too, but his response was more direct. He stopped by my apartment unannounced one evening in August, something he hadn't done in over 2 years. "Mom, what's going on with you?" he said, looking around my transformed living room with obvious confusion. "What do you mean, sweetheart? You look different. The apartment looks different. Sarah said you've been going out a lot, taking classes or something?" He said it like I'd been spotted doing drugs in the park. Like having interests outside of serving their needs was suspicious behavior requiring investigation. "I've been trying some new activities, meeting people, living life. But are you okay? I mean, financially and everything? If you're spending money you don't have..." There it was. The assumption that any improvement in my quality of life must be the result of financial irresponsibility. That I couldn't possibly afford to live modestly well without making poor decisions that would eventually become their problem. "I'm doing fine, Michael. Better than fine, actually." He looked skeptical, but didn't push the issue. I could see him trying to fit this new information into his existing narrative about me. His dependent mother was becoming someone he didn't recognize, and it was making him uncomfortable. That discomfort would soon become a much bigger problem for him. The moment I decided to reveal the truth came in October, almost 10 months after discovering my real financial situation. Sarah called me on a Tuesday morning in a state of panic that felt familiar but no longer moved me the way it once had. "Mom, we have an emergency. Josh lost his job yesterday, and we don't know how we're going to make the mortgage payment. We need help. We need it now." The old Elena would have scrambled to check her bank balance and figure out how to liquidate assets to save her daughter's family. The new Elena sat calmly in her comfortable chair, sipping coffee from a beautiful ceramic mug she'd made in pottery class, and felt nothing except mild curiosity about how this conversation would unfold. "That sounds very stressful, Sarah. What are you thinking about doing?" "Mom, we need money. We need at least $12,000 by the end of the month, or we're going to lose the house. You helped us before, and I know you don't have much, but maybe you could take out another loan or something. We're desperate." I was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside my window. Sarah was asking me to go into debt to solve a problem that was hers to solve. She was asking me to sacrifice my security so that she wouldn't have to face the consequences of her family's financial choices. But more than that, she was asking me to resume my role as the family's emergency fund. She wanted me to transform back into the version of myself that existed primarily to serve their needs. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay, Mom. What? If I couldn't help you financially, if I had no money to give you at all, would you still want me in your life? The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained and defensive. Mom, that's a terrible question. Of course we love you. This isn't about money, it's about family helping family. But you only call me when you need something. You only include me in your lives when I'm providing a service. So I'm genuinely curious about whether you have any use for me as a person rather than as a resource. That's not fair, Mom. We're busy. We have lives. Just because we don't talk every day doesn't mean we don't care about you. When was the last time you asked how I was feeling? Another long pause. We talk about that kind of thing. When, Sarah? When do we talk about my feelings, my health, my interests, my dreams? When do we talk about me as anything other than your emergency babysitter and loan officer? I could hear her starting to cry, but for the first time in decades, her tears didn't manipulate me into backing down. I felt sad for her, but I didn't feel responsible for fixing her distress. Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Why are you being so mean to me? We need help, and you're making this about something else entirely. I'm not being mean, sweetheart. I'm being honest. And honestly, I don't think you know who I am anymore. I don't think you've known for a very long time. What is that supposed to mean? I took a deep breath and prepared to step into the new version of my story. The version where I was the protagonist instead of the supporting character. It means that I'm not the helpless old woman you think I am. It means I've been living like I was poor when I'm actually quite comfortable financially. It means I've been begging for your attention and affection when I could have been living my own life with dignity and independence. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I could hear her breathing. Mom, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I have over $400,000 in assets. I'm talking about the fact that I could buy your house outright if I wanted to. I'm talking about the fact that I've been pretending to be needy and dependent because I thought it was the only way to stay connected to my children. I heard something that might have been a gasp or might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell which would have been more insulting. That's impossible. You live in that tiny apartment. You dress like you never have money for anything. I live in that apartment by choice, not necessity. I dress modestly because I thought you'd be ashamed of me if I looked wealthy. I never had money for things because I was giving it all to you and your brother instead of spending it on myself. The truth was pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. For months, I had been preparing for this moment, but I hadn't realized how much relief I would feel when it finally arrived. Sarah, I gave you $15,000 for your mortgage last year. That was my retirement money. Money I had set aside for my own security. But there were other accounts, other investments that I never touched because I was so focused on playing the role of the sacrificial mother. I don't understand. Why would you pretend to be poor? Because I was terrified that if you didn't need me, you wouldn't want me. Because I thought being useful was the same thing as being loved. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. The panic was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost calculating. Mom, if you have all this money, why are you making such a big deal about helping us now? $12,000 should be nothing to you. And there it was. Exactly the response I had been expecting and dreading. Not curiosity about why I had hidden my financial situation. Not concern about how lonely and desperate I must have been to live that way. Just an immediate recalculation of how much she could extract from me now that she knew the truth. Because, Sarah, Having money doesn't mean I'm obligated to solve your problems with it. Having wealth doesn't make me responsible for your family's financial choices. But we're family, Mom. Family helps family. Yes, we are family. But family relationships should be based on love and respect, not on financial transactions. When you call me, I want it to be because you miss talking to me, not because you need something from me. I could hear her husband Josh in the background asking what was happening. Their conversation was muffled, but I caught fragments. She's been rich this whole time, making us think she was broke. I don't know what her game is. When Sarah came back on the line, her tone was harder than I'd ever heard it. Mom, I need to process this. This is a lot to take in, but we still need help with the mortgage. I understand that you need to process it. Take all the time you need, but I won't be helping with the mortgage. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but not with fear or regret. With adrenaline. With the rush of finally standing up for myself after decades of accommodation and self-erasure. The phone started ringing again immediately. I turned it off and sat in my quiet apartment, listening to the sound of my own breathing and feeling more myself than I had in years. But I knew this was just the beginning. The real confrontation was still coming. Michael called 2 hours later from Sarah's phone. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Mom, what the hell is going on? Sarah is hysterical. She says you've been lying to us about money? I haven't been lying, Michael. I just haven't been telling you everything about my financial situation. That's the same thing, Mom. That's lying by omission. Do you understand how this makes us feel? We've been worried about you, thinking you could barely afford food, and meanwhile you're sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars? His indignation was breathtaking. He was angry not because I had been living in unnecessary poverty, but because I had allowed him to feel concerned about me under false pretenses. When, Michael? When exactly have you been worried about me? What do you mean when? We're always worried about you. Really? When was the last time you called to check on me without wanting something? When was the last time you invited me to dinner just because you wanted my company? That's not fair, Mom. We have busy lives. You know that. I do know that. What I'm trying to figure out is whether there's room in your busy lives for a relationship with me that doesn't involve me providing services or solving problems. This is ridiculous. You're making us sound like terrible people because we don't call you every single day. Most families don't talk constantly. You're right. Most families don't talk constantly. But most families don't ignore each other for months at a time either. Most children don't treat their parents like an inconvenience they have to manage. I could hear Sarah crying in the background and Josh's voice getting louder. Michael was clearly having this conversation in front of an audience, which explained his defensive tone. Mom, listen to yourself. You sound paranoid. You sound like you're making up problems that don't exist. The word paranoid hit me like a slap. It was the same dismissive language they used whenever I tried to express hurt or disappointment about their behavior. Any attempt to discuss our relationship dynamics was reframed as emotional instability on my part. Michael, I've been keeping track of our interactions for the past several months. Would you like me to tell you exactly how many times you've contacted me and what you wanted each time? You've been keeping track of our phone calls? Mom, that's not normal behavior. What's not normal is having adult children who only contact me when they need something. What's not normal is spending birthdays alone because your children can't be bothered to acknowledge your existence. Oh my God, here we go with the birthday thing again. Mom, we sent you cards. You sent me a text message at 11:30 at night, after Sarah reminded you. The silence told me he didn't remember the text message at all. He had no memory of my birthday because it hadn't been important enough to make an impression. Look, Mom, I don't know what weird headspace you're in right now, but Sarah really needs help. If you have money and you're refusing to help your own daughter keep her house, then you're being deliberately cruel. I'm being deliberately healthy. I'm setting boundaries for the first time in my adult life. Boundaries? Since when do you talk like that? Have you been seeing a therapist or something? Because you sound like you're reading from a self-help book. The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. God forbid his mother should learn to advocate for herself or examine the dynamics of their relationship. God forbid I should develop language to describe what had been happening between us for years. Michael, I want you to think very carefully about what you're saying to me right now. Your daughter needs money, so you called me. Not to catch up on my life, not to see how I'm doing, but to guilt me into solving her problem. When I declined, you didn't ask why or try to understand my perspective. You immediately started attacking me personally, suggesting that I'm mentally unwell because I'm not immediately opening my checkbook. That's not what I'm doing. That's exactly what you're doing. And it's what you've been doing for years. You've trained me to believe that my value as a mother depends on how much I can give you. You've made me feel guilty for having needs, wants, or opinions that don't center around serving your family. I could hear Josh in the background saying something about manipulative old people, and Sarah shushing him. The whole conversation was taking place in front of an audience that had already decided I was the villain in this story. Mom, I think you need to calm down and think about what you're saying. We love you. We've always loved you. Just because we don't express it the way you want doesn't mean it's not real. How do you express it, Michael? Help me understand. Because from where I'm sitting, your love looks exactly like neglect with occasional requests for favors. This is insane. I'm not having this conversation when you're being irrational. And he hung up on me. My own son hung up on me rather than engage with the possibility that their treatment of me had been unfair. I sat in my living room as the afternoon light faded, feeling strangely calm despite the emotional intensity of the past few hours. I had finally said things that had been building inside me for years. I had finally refused to accept the role they had assigned me in their lives. It felt like standing up after being crouched in a small space for so long that I'd forgotten I could straighten my spine. But I knew they weren't finished with me yet. This kind of family drama doesn't resolve with a single conversation. There would be escalation, manipulation, and attempts to force me back into my previous role. They would try every strategy they'd used successfully for years to make me compliant and accommodating again. I was ready for them. The first volley came that evening in the form of a group text message that included both children, their spouses, and my 3 grandchildren over the age of 16. The message was from Sarah. Family meeting tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Mom's apartment. We need to discuss some concerning behavior and figure out how to move forward as a family. The language was carefully chosen to make me sound like a problem they needed to manage rather than a person they needed to understand. Concerning behavior suggested mental illness or emotional instability. Move forward as a family implied that I was the obstacle preventing family harmony. I screenshot the message and sent it to my friend Patricia from book club, adding, "Is this how normal families handle disagreements?" She called me immediately. "Elena, honey, that text message sounds like an intervention notice. What on earth is going on?" I explained the situation, and Patricia listened with the shocked silence of someone witnessing emotional abuse from the outside. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully about your answer. If these people weren't related to you, if they were friends or acquaintances who treated you this way, what would you do?" The question clarified everything instantly. If friends ignored me except when they needed favors, I would stop considering them friends. If acquaintances spoke to me the way Michael had spoken to me that afternoon, I would cut off contact immediately. If strangers tried to hold a meeting to discuss my concerning behavior, I would refuse to participate. But because they were family, I had tolerated treatment that I would never accept from anyone else. I had made excuses for cruelty that would have ended any other relationship years earlier. "Patricia, I think I need to not be home tomorrow night. Good girl. Don't give them the opportunity to gang up on you. Make them work for your attention instead of demanding it as a right. That night, I turned off my phone and took a long bath surrounded by candles and plants. I practiced what I would say when they eventually cornered me. I rehearsed setting boundaries with the same confidence I would use to refuse an aggressive salesperson or dismiss a rude stranger. The next morning, I left my apartment early and spent the day in Manhattan. I visited museums, had lunch at a lovely restaurant overlooking Central Park, and attended a matinee performance at a small theater near Times Square. I was living the kind of day I'd dreamed about during all those years of rationing every dollar and every movement. When I finally returned home around 9 p.m., there were 17 missed calls and 23 text messages on my phone. The messages ranged from concerned to frustrated to furious. But the pattern was telling. Not a single message asked if I was okay or expressed worry about my safety. They were all focused on my failure to make myself available for their scheduled confrontation. From Michael, "Where are you? We all came here to talk to you." From Sarah, "Mom, this is really immature. We need to have this conversation." From Sarah's husband, Josh, "Elena, avoiding us isn't going to solve anything." From my 16-year-old grandson, Tommy, "Grandma, everyone is really upset. Can you please just call?" The final message was from Michael, sent just an hour earlier. "Mom, if you don't respond soon, we're going to assume something has happened to you and call the police for a wellness check." The threat was clear and manipulative. They were attempting to force me to respond by suggesting that my desire for space was evidence of mental or physical crisis. They were weaponizing their concern as a way to control my behavior. I called Patricia instead of calling them back. "Elena, they're trying to scare you into compliance," she said immediately after I read her the messages. "This is what abusers do when their victims start setting boundaries. They escalate the pressure." The word abusers shocked me. I had never thought of Michael and Sarah that way. They were my children. They were busy, self-absorbed, sometimes thoughtless, but not abusers. "Patricia, that seems like a strong word. Honey, emotional abuse doesn't require physical violence. It doesn't require screaming or name-calling. When people consistently ignore your needs, dismiss your feelings, exploit your resources, and then punish you for trying to protect yourself, that's abuse. When they make you question your own perceptions and convince you that you're being unreasonable for wanting basic respect, that's called gaslighting." I had heard the term gaslighting before, but never applied it to my own life. The idea that my children had been systematically undermining my ability to trust my own experiences was almost too painful to consider. But as I thought about years of being told I was too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional whenever I tried to address problems in our relationships, I realized Patricia might be right. I had been trained to doubt my own perceptions and blame myself for the dysfunction between us. What should I do about the messages? Send one text message. Tell them you're safe, you need space to think, and you'll contact them when you're ready. Then turn off your phone for a few days and let them sit with their anxiety. I crafted a message that was polite but firm. "I'm safe and well. I need some time to think about our relationships and how we want to move forward. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to have a productive conversation. Please respect my need for space during this time." The response was immediate and explosive. Michael called 14 times in a row. Sarah sent a series of increasingly frantic texts accusing me of emotional manipulation and threatening to show up at my apartment with a key she'd had made years earlier for emergencies. That final threat decided me. I packed a bag and checked into a small hotel in Midtown Manhattan. If they wanted to have tantrums and make threats, they could do it in my empty apartment while I enjoyed room service and cable television. For 3 days, I lived like a tourist in my own city. I visited galleries, took walking tours, tried restaurants I'd never been able to afford. I had conversations with strangers in coffee shops and bookstores. I remembered what it felt like to be curious about the world instead of constantly braced for the next family crisis. On the third day, I decided I was ready to go home and deal with whatever was waiting for me. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, but there were signs that someone had been there. A window was open that I distinctly remembered closing. A few books on my coffee table were slightly rearranged. Sarah had used her emergency key to enter my apartment without permission, probably to make sure I hadn't died or disappeared. The violation felt profound. Not only had they refused to respect my request for space, they had entered my private sanctuary to satisfy their own anxiety. The emergency key had been intended for actual emergencies, not for overriding my personal boundaries when they became inconvenient. I called a locksmith immediately and had all the locks changed. Then I sent a group text to both children. I'm home safely. I know someone entered my apartment while I was away. I've changed the locks. When you're ready to have a respectful conversation about our relationships, you can call me. Michael's response came within minutes. Mom, Sarah was worried sick about you. She used the key because we thought something might have happened. You can't just disappear and then act like we're the bad guys for caring. The reframing was masterful. My need for space had become disappearing. Their boundary violations had become caring. My request for respect had been transformed into evidence of my unreasonableness. But I was no longer susceptible to this kind of manipulation. I could see the techniques clearly now, like magic tricks explained by a magician. The spell was broken. Michael, I specifically asked for space to think. I told you I was safe and would be in touch when I was ready. Using the emergency key to enter my apartment without permission was a violation of my privacy and my trust. We were worried about you. You were acting completely out of character. So, setting boundaries and taking care of myself is out of character because I haven't done it before. But it's not concerning behavior. It's healthy behavior. Mom, this whole thing is getting out of hand. Can we please just sit down and talk like adults? I would love to talk like adults. That means listening to each other's perspectives without immediately dismissing them. It means acknowledging when we've hurt someone instead of defending ourselves. Are you ready for that kind of conversation? The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller. I don't know, Mom. I honestly don't know what you want from us. It was the first genuine thing he'd said to me in this entire conflict. The first admission that he didn't understand, rather than insistence that I was wrong. I want to be treated like a person whose feelings matter. I want conversations that aren't just requests for favors. I want relationships with my children that are based on mutual affection rather than obligation and utility. We do care about you. We love you. I believe that you love the version of me that serves your needs. I'm less sure that you love the version of me that has her own needs and opinions. That's not fair. Michael, when was the last time you asked about my pottery class? When was the last time you inquired about my book club or my volunteer work? When was the last time you showed interest in my life that had nothing to do with your family's needs? Another long silence. I guess I didn't know you were interested in pottery. I've been taking classes for 4 months. I've mentioned it in several conversations. I'm sorry. I guess I wasn't really listening. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd received from either of my children in recent memory. Not an excuse, not a deflection, but an acknowledgement that he had been focused on his own concerns to the exclusion of mine. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot to hear you acknowledge it. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you tell us about the money? I understand why you're upset about how we've been treating you, but I don't understand the secrecy about your finances. It was a fair question, and I had been thinking about the answer for weeks. Because I was afraid that if you knew I was financially secure, you would have even less reason to include me in your lives. I thought being useful was the only thing that made me valuable to you. That's not true, Mom. Isn't it? Look at how this conversation started, Michael. Sarah called me in a panic about her mortgage. When I declined to help, instead of asking why or trying to understand my perspective, you both immediately began attacking my character and questioning my mental health. We were shocked. We felt like you'd been lying to us. I understand that you were shocked. But your response to being shocked was to become angry with me rather than concerned about why I felt like I needed to hide my financial situation. You focused on how my choices affected you rather than trying to understand what I had been going through. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was very small. Mom, are we terrible people? The question broke my heart in a completely different way than their neglect had broken it. This was the voice of my little boy asking if he was in trouble, if he was disappointing me, if he was beyond redemption. No, sweetheart, you're not terrible people. You're adults who learned some unhealthy patterns and haven't examined them yet. But you can change those patterns if you want to. How? Start by thinking about what you want our relationship to look like going forward. Not what you think I want, but what would make you happy to have with your mother. Then think about what steps would move us in that direction. I want to talk to you more. I want to know about your pottery class and your book club. I want to not take you for granted anymore. I started crying. Not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time in years, I was talking to my son instead of to the defensive, dismissive version of himself he'd been performing for our entire adult relationship. Michael, that sounds wonderful. I would love that kind of relationship with you. What about Sarah? She's really upset about the mortgage thing. Sarah and I will need to have our own conversation. Her situation is different from yours. Different how? She asked me to solve a problem that she and her husband should solve themselves. She tried to manipulate me into sacrificing my security for their comfort. That's a bigger issue than just poor communication patterns. But if you have the money, and she really needs help. And there it was. Even in his moment of emerging self-awareness, Michael was still trying to convince me to resume my role as the family's emergency fund. Michael, having money doesn't create an obligation to solve other people's problems with it. If Sarah and Josh can't afford their house, they need to downsize, refinance, or find other solutions. They don't need to pressure elderly relatives into covering their expenses. But we're not just any elderly relatives, we're your children. That's exactly why pressuring me is inappropriate. You should want to protect me from financial stress, not create it for me. I could hear him processing this idea, trying to fit it into his existing worldview about family obligations and parental duties. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't, until they're in a position where someone expects them to sacrifice their well-being for someone else's convenience. We talked for another hour, covering years of accumulated misunderstandings and missed connections. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it felt like the beginning of a different kind of relationship. One where both of us were allowed to be real people with our own needs and limitations. I wasn't ready to forgive everything immediately, and I wasn't prepared to return to my previous level of availability and accommodation. But I was hopeful that Michael and I might be able to build something healthier together. Sarah would be a much more complicated situation. She called me the next morning, and her tone was completely different from Michael's late-night vulnerability. She was angry, defensive, and focused entirely on her own crisis. Mom, I can't believe you're willing to let us lose our house over some kind of control game. Sarah, this isn't a game. This is me learning to have healthy boundaries in our relationship. Healthy boundaries? Mom, we're about to be homeless, and you're talking about boundaries? You're not going to be homeless. You have options. You can refinance, you can take out a loan, you can downsize to something more affordable. You have choices that don't involve pressuring me to solve your problems. Those aren't real options and you know it. Our credit isn't good enough for refinancing. We can't qualify for a big enough loan. And if we sell the house, the kids will have to change schools. You're asking us to turn our lives upside down when you could fix everything with one check." The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. Every alternative solution was dismissed as impossible. Every consequence of their choices was reframed as my responsibility. The emotional welfare of my grandchildren was weaponized to guilt me into compliance. "Sarah, I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm declining to solve a problem that isn't mine to solve. How can you say it's not your problem? We're your family." "You're my family, which is exactly why I want you to learn to handle your own financial challenges instead of depending on bailouts from relatives." That's easy for you to say when you're sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars. The amount of money I have doesn't change the fact that your mortgage is your responsibility, not mine. Mom, I don't understand what happened to you. You used to care about us. You used to want to help when we were struggling. The accusation that I no longer cared about them was designed to make me feel guilty for setting boundaries. It was the same technique I'd seen her use with her children when they didn't immediately comply with her requests. "Sarah, I do care about you. Caring about someone doesn't mean solving all their problems for them. Sometimes caring means letting people handle their own challenges so they can develop strength and independence." "That's a bunch of therapy speak bullshit, Mom. We need practical help, not life lessons." Her contempt for the idea that I might have been working on myself, might have been learning and growing, was identical to Michael's initial reaction. In their worldview, personal development was self-indulgent nonsense that interfered with my availability to serve their needs. "Sarah, I've been giving you practical help for your entire adult life. I've been solving your problems and covering your expenses and bailing you out of financial emergencies for decades. When has that ever taught you to manage money better or make more sustainable choices? That's not fair. We've had bad luck." "Bad luck doesn't last for 15 years, sweetheart. At some point, a pattern of financial crises becomes evidence of financial management problems." I could hear Josh in the background getting agitated, and Sarah's voice became sharper. "Mom, Josh wants to talk to you." Before I could object, she handed him the phone. Josh had never spoken to me directly about money before, though I'd often overheard his complaints about my interference in their finances. "Elena, I'm going to be very direct with you because I think Sarah has been too polite." His tone was condescending in a way that made my skin crawl. This was how he spoke to service people and subordinates, not to family members. "You have been playing games with this family for months. First pretending to be poor, then disappearing for days, now refusing to help when we're in real trouble. I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, but it needs to stop." The accusation that setting boundaries was a power trip revealed everything I needed to know about how this man viewed me. In his mind, any attempt to assert my own needs was an inappropriate grab for control. "Josh, I'm not playing games. I'm making different choices about how I want to live my life. Your choices are hurting your daughter and your grandchildren. Is that really what you want?" The attempt to make me responsible for the consequences of their financial decisions was predictable, but no less infuriating. He was trying to convince me that their failure to plan appropriately had somehow become my moral failing. "Josh, I want my daughter and grandchildren to be happy and secure. But that security can't be built on expectations that elderly relatives will cover your expenses whenever you overextend yourselves." "We didn't overextend ourselves. Josh lost his job. That's not something we could have planned for." Job loss is exactly the kind of thing families should have emergency funds for. It's one of the most common financial challenges adults face. Easy to say when you've been hoarding money while we thought you were barely surviving. The word hoarding was chosen carefully. It suggested that keeping my own money was pathological, that failing to spend my assets on their needs was evidence of mental illness or moral deficiency. I wasn't hoarding money, Josh. I was living below my means while contributing far more to this family's financial needs than I could afford. Well, now it's time to contribute again. Sarah is your daughter. These are your grandchildren. If you let them lose their house, you'll be destroying this family. The threat was explicit now. Help them or lose access to your grandchildren. Comply or be cut off from the family relationships I valued most. But I was no longer susceptible to this kind of emotional blackmail. I had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Josh, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. I'm listening. I will not be financially responsible for choices that adults make about their housing, employment, or lifestyle. I will not cover expenses that should be covered by budgeting, insurance, or emergency savings. I will not sacrifice my financial security to solve problems that have other solutions. So you're abandoning us. I'm establishing boundaries that should have existed years ago. What about the grandchildren? You're willing to let them suffer for your principles. The grandchildren will be fine. Children are resilient. They adapt to changes in housing and schools much better than adults do. What they don't adapt well to is watching their parents manipulate and exploit their grandmother. The silence was so complete I thought he might have hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was cold with rage. Elena, you are making a very big mistake. Sarah has been protecting you from the family's real feelings about your behavior for years. We've all been walking on eggshells around your neediness and your constant demands for attention. If you want to burn bridges, fine. But don't expect to rebuild them later when you're sitting alone in that apartment with no one who cares whether you live or die. The cruelty was breathtaking. He had taken my deepest fear, the terror of being alone and forgotten, and weaponized it as a punishment for refusing to be exploited. But instead of feeling destroyed, I felt liberated. He had revealed exactly who he was and what he thought of me. There was no ambiguity left, no room for self-doubt about whether I was overreacting or being unreasonable. Josh, thank you for being so honest about how you see me. It clarifies a lot. What's that supposed to mean? It means I understand now that you view me as an ATM with emotional problems rather than as a person deserving of respect. It means I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You're twisting my words. I'm repeating your words. You just threatened to isolate me from my grandchildren because I won't pay your bills. You just described my desire for meaningful relationships as neediness and attention-seeking. You just suggested that my worth as a human being depends on my financial usefulness to your family. That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said. And you know what, Josh? You've done me a tremendous favor. I've been wondering whether I was being too sensitive or expecting too much from this family. You've just confirmed that I've actually been expecting far too little. I hung up before he could respond. My heart was pounding, but not with anxiety. With adrenaline. With the rush of finally standing up to years of accumulated abuse and disrespect. A few minutes later, Sarah called back. She was crying, but her tears no longer moved me the way they once had. Mom, Josh is really upset. He said you were incredibly rude to him. Sarah, your husband just threatened to cut off my access to my grandchildren unless I pay your mortgage. He called me needy and suggested that I have no value as a human being beyond my financial usefulness. If that's his definition of polite conversation, then yes, I was rude. He's just stressed about the house. He didn't mean those things. He meant every word, and the fact that you're defending him instead of being horrified by how he spoke to your mother tells me everything I need to know about where your loyalties lie. It's not about loyalties, Mom. We're a family. We should be working together to solve problems. You're absolutely right. We should be working together. Which means you and Josh should be working together to solve your financial problems instead of demanding that I solve them for you. You know what? Fine. Don't help us. But don't expect things to go back to normal between us. Don't expect me to call you every week or include you in family events if you're not willing to be there when we need you. And there it was. The explicit quid pro quo that had been governing our relationship for years. access to family life in exchange for financial services, love as a transaction. Sarah, I wouldn't want things to go back to normal. Normal was you only calling when you needed something. Normal was me being treated like hired help instead of like your mother. Normal was lonely and painful and unsustainable. I can't deal with this right now. I have real problems to worry about. She hung up on me too. I sat in my quiet apartment, looking around at the space I had transformed over the past year, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Complete, profound peace. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the constant anxiety of wondering what my children needed from me next. Free from the exhausting emotional labor of managing their feelings and solving their problems. Free from the grinding guilt of never being enough while simultaneously being taken for granted. The phone sat silent on my coffee table. No emergency calls, no crisis management requests, no demands for my immediate attention and resources. Just silence. I made myself a cup of tea and called my friend Patricia. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "Like a controlled demolition," I said. "Messy and dramatic, but ultimately clearing space for something better to be built." "Are you okay?" I thought about the question seriously. Was I okay? I had just ended my relationship with my daughter and son-in-law. I had probably damaged my relationship with my grandchildren. I had chosen principles over family harmony and independence over inclusion. "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm free." That freedom lasted about 6 hours. At 11 p.m., my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed my grandson Tommy's name. He was 17, old enough to understand family drama, but young enough to be genuinely distressed by it. "Grandma, what's happening? Mom is crying and Dad is yelling and everyone keeps talking about money and mortgages and I don't understand any of it." My resolve wavered immediately. Whatever issues I had with Sarah and Josh, my grandchildren were innocent. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of adult conflicts or used as weapons in family battles. "Tommy, sweetheart, your parents are having some financial stress, and we're having some disagreements about how to handle it." "But Mom said you have lots of money and you're refusing to help us. She said we might have to move out of our house." The fact that Sarah had involved the children in the details of our conflict was deeply inappropriate. She was using their fear and confusion to pressure me into compliance, which was emotional abuse of both the children and me. "Tommy, financial problems are for adults to solve. Children shouldn't have to worry about mortgages or moving houses. Your parents will figure something out. But if you can help, why won't you? Don't you love us anymore?" And there it was. The question that Sarah had undoubtedly coached him to ask, the guilt trip disguised as innocent childhood confusion. She had weaponized my grandchild's love for me as a tool of manipulation. "Tommy, I love you and your sister more than you could possibly understand. My love for you has nothing to do with money, and it never will." "Then why won't you help us?" How do you explain healthy boundaries to a 17-year-old whose parents have just used him as an emotional pawn? How do you describe the difference between love and enablement to a child who's been taught that family means never saying no to each other? "Tommy, sometimes loving someone means letting them solve their own problems so they can become stronger and more independent. If I solve every problem for your parents, they won't learn how to handle difficult situations on their own." That sounds like something you'd say if you didn't really want to help. Sarah had coached him well. The response was too sophisticated, too perfectly designed to provoke guilt, to be his own authentic reaction. "Tommy, I want you to remember something, okay? No matter what happens with this house situation, no matter what your parents might say about me in the coming weeks, I love you and Emma completely and unconditionally. That love doesn't depend on money or houses or solving problems. It just exists because you're my grandchildren and you're wonderful people." "Grandma, are you going away?" The question broke my heart. Not because I was planning to disappear, but because his parents had clearly suggested that possibility as a consequence of my failure to comply with their demands. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. I'll always be your grandmother, and I'll always be here if you need me. But I won't be solving your parents' financial problems, and that's okay. They're smart, capable adults who can handle this challenge." "I hope so. I really like our house." "I know you do. And whatever happens, you'll be okay." Sometimes changes that seem scary at first turn out to be adventures. After I hung up, I felt physically sick. Using children as emotional weapons was a line I had never imagined my own daughter would cross. The fact that she was willing to traumatize her own children in order to manipulate me revealed a level of selfishness that I was still struggling to accept. But it also clarified something important. This wasn't just about money or boundaries or healthy family relationships. This was about two fundamentally different value systems colliding. Sarah believed that family members existed to serve each other's needs regardless of the personal cost. I was learning to believe that family members should enhance each other's lives without sacrificing their own well-being. Those two beliefs were incompatible. One of us was going to have to change, or our relationship was going to end permanently. I spent the weekend thinking about what kind of future I wanted to create for myself. Not what I thought my children wanted, not what I thought I owed them based on motherhood or family obligation, but what would make me happy and fulfilled in whatever years I had left. The answer was surprisingly clear. I wanted relationships that were based on mutual affection rather than need. I wanted to spend my time and energy on activities that brought me joy instead of constantly managing other people's crises. I wanted to use my remaining years for personal growth, new experiences, and genuine connections with people who valued me as a complete person. I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to prioritize my own happiness. On Sunday, I did something unprecedented. I planned a vacation. Not a family visit disguised as a vacation, not a trip based on what others expected me to want, but a genuinely selfish adventure designed entirely around my own interests and desires. I booked a pottery retreat in Vermont for the following month. 5 days of classes, workshops, and creative exploration with other adults who shared my newfound passion. I would stay in a beautiful inn, eat meals I didn't have to cook, and focus entirely on making art with my hands. For weeks, I had been talking about setting boundaries and claiming my independence. This trip would be the concrete manifestation of those abstract concepts. I would spend my own money on my own pleasure without asking anyone's permission or justifying my choices. The retreat was expensive, but I could easily afford it. The realization that I could afford many things I had been denying myself for years was still startling. I could travel, take classes, buy art, support causes I cared about, and live comfortably without worrying about every expense. I had been living like a poor person while sitting on resources that could have made my life immeasurably more enjoyable. I had been denying myself comfort and pleasure while funding other people's lifestyle choices and emergencies. That dynamic was ending permanently. Monday morning brought a new development. Michael called early before I'd even finished my coffee. "Mom, we need to talk." "Good morning to you too, Michael." "Sorry, good morning. Listen, I had a long conversation with Sarah yesterday about everything that's been happening." "Okay. I think you should know that Josh is telling people you have dementia." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because I believed them, but because the strategic maliciousness of the lie was so shocking. "He's telling people what?" "He called my wife Jennifer and told her you've been acting erratically and making irrational financial decisions. He suggested that someone should contact Adult Protective Services because you're not competent to manage your own affairs." The attack was sophisticated and potentially devastating. If Josh could create a narrative about my mental competence, he could potentially challenge my legal right to control my own assets. He could turn my newfound independence into evidence of cognitive decline. "Michael, do I sound incompetent to you?" "No, Mom. You sound clearer and more focused than you have in years. That's why I'm calling to warn you instead of just believing what he says." I felt a wave of gratitude for my son that surprised me with its intensity. Despite all our issues, he was protecting me from his brother-in-law's malicious campaign. "Thank you for telling me." "What exactly did he say?" "He said you've been hiding money, living in squalor, disappearing for days, and making threats about cutting off the family. He made it sound like you're paranoid and delusional." "And what did Jennifer say?" "She said it sounded like you were finally standing up for yourself, and it was about time. She never liked how Sarah and Josh treated you. My daughter-in-law, who I'd always assumed barely tolerated me, had defended me against accusations of mental illness." The revelation was almost as surprising as Josh's attack. "I had no idea Jennifer felt that way." "Mom, a lot of people have noticed how Sarah and Josh treat you. It's not just in your head." The validation meant more to me than I could express. For years, I had wondered if I was being overly sensitive or expecting too much. The confirmation that outside observers had seen the dysfunction was both relieving and heartbreaking. "Michael, I need to ask you something important. Do you think I'm showing signs of dementia or mental illness?" "God, no. You're the most mentally sharp you've been since Dad died. You're making decisions based on your own needs instead of just reacting to everyone else's demands. That's not dementia. That's emotional health." "Then why would Josh make accusations like that?" "Because he's panicking. Because they really can't afford their house, and they're used to you being their emergency backup plan. Because he thought he could manipulate you back into compliance by threatening your reputation and your independence." The clinical assessment was probably accurate, but it didn't make the situation less dangerous. False accusations of incompetence could have real legal and social consequences, especially for elderly people who didn't have strong support systems. What should I do? Document everything. Save all your text messages and emails. Keep records of your financial transactions and decision-making. Maybe talk to a lawyer about protecting yourself legally. This is insane. I'm being punished for learning to say no. Welcome to the reality of dealing with people who are used to controlling you. When you stop being controllable, they escalate their tactics. After we hung up, I realized that Michael had become an ally in a conflict I hadn't wanted to have. His support felt like a gift I hadn't expected, and probably didn't deserve after years of taking his presence in my life for granted. But I also realized that this situation was going to get worse before it got better. Josh wasn't going to accept defeat gracefully. He was going to fight dirty, and he was going to try to destroy my reputation and independence in the process. I needed professional help. That afternoon, I made 2 appointments. The first was with Margaret Chen, my financial advisor, to discuss protecting my assets from potential legal challenges. The second was with an elder law attorney recommended by Patricia's social worker friend. Margaret was reassuring. My financial records clearly demonstrated years of competent decision-making, strategic planning, and thoughtful asset management. Any attempt to challenge my mental capacity would have to overcome substantial evidence of financial sophistication. The lawyer, Robert Steinberg, was more concerned about the social and familial aspects of Josh's campaign. "Mrs. Martinez, accusations of incompetence can be very damaging even when they're false. They can isolate you from family members who might start questioning your decisions. They can make service providers reluctant to work with you. They can create a cloud of suspicion that follows you even after you've proven the accusations wrong. What can I do to protect myself? Document everything. Create a paper trail that demonstrates your competence and decision-making capacity. Consider getting a formal mental health evaluation from a geriatric psychiatrist that can serve as evidence if needed. Should I be worried about adult protective services? If someone actually calls APS, they'll investigate. But based on what you've told me about your living situation, your social activities, and your financial management, I don't think you'd be considered at risk. The greater danger is the damage to your family relationships and social reputation. That evening, I sat in my comfortable, well-appointed apartment and tried to process what my life had become. 6 months ago, I had been a lonely, forgotten old woman living in artificial poverty while my children ignored me except when they needed favors. Now I was a mentally sharp, financially secure, socially active woman being accused of dementia by relatives who wanted to control my assets. The transformation was so complete it felt surreal. I had gone from invisible to threatening, from pathetic to dangerous, simply by learning to prioritize my own well-being. But I wasn't going back. Whatever Josh tried to do to me, whatever lies he spread or legal challenges he mounted, I wasn't going to return to the small, sad existence I'd been living before. I had tasted freedom and dignity, and those flavors were too sweet to give up now. That night, I did something that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. I blocked Sarah's, Josh's, and Tommy's phone numbers. I loved my grandson, but I couldn't allow him to be used as a weapon against me. If he wanted to contact me when he was older and could make his own choices, I would be here. But I wouldn't participate in the emotional manipulation anymore. The next morning, my phone was blissfully quiet. No crisis calls, no emergency requests, no guilt trips disguised as family concern. Just silence and the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the city waking up outside my window. I made coffee, read the newspaper, and planned my day around activities that brought me pleasure. Book club at 2, pottery class at 4, dinner with Maria from my volunteer program at 7. A full schedule of genuine connections and meaningful activities. For the first time in decades, I was living entirely for myself. And it felt magnificent. The breakthrough with Michael surprised me by coming at the most ordinary moment. He stopped by the following Saturday with Jennifer and their teenage daughter Sophia, not to ask for anything but simply to visit. They brought bagels from a bakery near their apartment and spent 2 hours sitting around my kitchen table talking about books, politics, current events, and family memories. Michael apologized for not noticing my pottery classes and then asked detailed questions about the techniques I was learning. Jennifer shared stories about her own creative hobbies and suggested we might take a workshop together sometime. Sophia, who I'd barely spoken to in years beyond holiday small talk, revealed herself to be thoughtful and articulate about social justice issues I cared deeply about. It was the kind of family visit I'd dreamed of for years, but had stopped believing was possible. Relaxed, genuine, focused on getting to know each other, rather than managing crises or fulfilling obligations. As they prepared to leave, Michael hugged me in a way that felt different from his usual perfunctory goodbye embraces. "Mom, I'm really sorry it took me so long to see what was happening. I'm sorry you felt like you had to pretend to be poor to get our attention. Michael, you don't need to apologize for the past. I'm just grateful for who you're choosing to be now. I want us to have regular dinners, not just holidays or emergencies, but actual planned time together because we enjoy each other's company. I would love that more than you know." After they left, I cried tears of relief and joy. One of my children had seen through the dysfunction to find genuine love underneath. One of my relationships had been salvaged from the wreckage of codependency and transformed into something healthy and sustainable. It gave me hope that someday, maybe, Sarah would find her way back too. But that reunion was still months away, and the path to it would be more complicated than I could have imagined. The first sign that Sarah was reconsidering her position came in the form of a handwritten letter delivered to my apartment 3 weeks after I'd blocked their phone numbers. The envelope was addressed in her familiar handwriting, but the contents surprised me. "Mom, I know you won't answer calls right now, and I understand why. Josh said some terrible things to you, and I should have stopped him. I should have defended you instead of letting him treat you that way. I was scared about the house, and I let that fear make me cruel to the person who has always been there for me." The letter was 2 pages long and covered years of accumulated resentments, misunderstandings, and missed opportunities for genuine connection. She acknowledged taking my availability for granted and treating me like a service provider rather than a person with her own needs and feelings. But the most surprising part was her conclusion. We ended up keeping the house by taking out a second mortgage, which we should have done in the first place, instead of asking you to solve our problems. You were right to say no, even though I couldn't see it at the time. I'm learning that depending on you for emergencies was keeping Josh and me from becoming real adults who could handle our own challenges. I read the letter 3 times, looking for signs of manipulation or ulterior motives. But it seemed genuine. Sarah had managed to find perspective beyond her immediate needs and consider how their financial dependence on me had affected everyone involved. I didn't respond immediately. She had hurt me too deeply, and her husband had threatened me too explicitly, for me to simply accept an apology and return to our previous dynamic. But the letter felt like a first step toward something different, something healthier. 2 months later, Sarah reached out again through Michael. She wanted to meet for coffee, just the 2 of us, to continue the conversation her letter had started. No requests for money, no crisis to be solved, just a desire to rebuild our relationship on more sustainable terms. I agreed, but I chose the location. A small cafe near Central Park, where I felt comfortable and confident, where I had become a regular customer during my months of reclaiming my independence. Sarah looked different when she arrived. Older, more tired, but also more present somehow. She wasn't rushing through the conversation to get to a request, or managing her emotional presentation to achieve a particular outcome. She was just there, as herself, ready to have whatever difficult conversation we needed to have. "Mom, I owe you a massive apology." "Sarah, you don't owe me anything, but I would like to understand what's changed for you." Losing access to you as our emergency backup plan forced Josh and me to look at our financial situation honestly for the first time in years. We realized that we'd been living beyond our means and expecting you to cover the difference whenever we miscalculated. That must have been difficult to recognize. It was humiliating, but it was also liberating. We've learned to budget properly, build emergency savings, and make decisions based on what we can actually afford instead of what we want. She showed me pictures on her phone of the changes they'd made. A smaller car, a refinanced mortgage with a payment plan they could manage, a household budget that included savings and contingencies. They had downsized their lifestyle but gained financial stability in the process. Josh has been going to therapy to work on his anger and control issues. What he said to you was unforgivable, and he knows it. He's not ready to apologize yet, but he's working on understanding why he felt entitled to treat you that way. And how do you feel about our relationship? Not what you think I want to hear, but what you actually think and feel. She was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup and choosing her words carefully. "I think I confused loving you with needing you. I think I treated you like a parent who existed primarily to solve my problems instead of like a separate person with your own life and dreams. I think I took your sacrifices for granted and assumed they were just part of what mothers do, instead of recognizing them as choices you made because you loved us. What would you like our relationship to look like going forward? I want to know you as Elena, not just as my mother. I want to hear about your pottery classes and your book club and your volunteer work. I want to share my life with you because I enjoy your company, not because I need something from you." That sounds wonderful. But Sarah, I need you to understand that I can't go back to being available for financial emergencies or unlimited babysitting. I can't be the family's backup plan anymore. I know. And honestly, I don't want that responsibility for you anymore. It was too much pressure on both of us. We talked for 3 hours, covering everything from childhood memories to current events to dreams for the future. It felt like getting to know my daughter as an adult for the first time, rather than just managing our mother-child dynamic through an endless series of crises and obligations. When we parted ways, Sarah hugged me with genuine warmth rather than performative affection. "Mom, I love you. Not for what you can do for me, but for who you are. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out the difference." I walked home through Central Park, watching families and couples and groups of friends enjoying the autumn afternoon. For years, I'd felt like an observer of other people's happiness, watching from the outside as they lived the connected, meaningful lives I thought were impossible for someone like me. But now I was living that life too. I had genuine relationships based on mutual affection and respect. I had activities that brought me joy and fulfillment. I had financial security and independence. I had, for the first time in my adult life, a sense of my own worth that didn't depend on how much I could sacrifice for others. The transformation from the invisible, impoverished woman I'd been masquerading as to the confident, financially secure person I actually was hadn't been easy. It had cost me relationships, forced me to confront painful truths about family dynamics, and required me to develop strength I didn't know I possessed. But it had given me something even more valuable: myself. My own life, lived on my own terms, according to my own values and desires. That evening, I called Michael and asked if he and Jennifer would like to join me for dinner at a restaurant I'd been wanting to try. Not because it was someone's birthday or because there was crisis to discuss, but simply because I enjoyed their company and wanted to share a meal with people I loved. As we sat around the table, talking and laughing and enjoying each other's presence, I realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation or emergency management or financial negotiation, but genuine affection and mutual respect, and the simple pleasure of being together. I had spent 72 years learning that love wasn't something you earned through sacrifice or purchased with services. Love was something you gave and received freely, without conditions or transactions, simply because the people involved enhanced each other's lives by existing. It had taken me 7 decades to understand that I deserved love, not because of what I could provide, but because of who I was. That realization had changed everything. 6 months after that conversation with Sarah, I was sitting in my pottery studio in Brooklyn, working on a series of bowls inspired by the colors of sunset over the Manhattan skyline. My hands were covered in clay, my mind was quiet and focused, and I was creating something beautiful with my own skills and imagination. The studio was full of other adults pursuing their own creative visions. Maria was working on a sculpture series about immigration and belonging. James was painting portraits of other students, capturing the concentration and joy on their faces as they worked. Patricia was throwing large vessels that she planned to donate to a fundraising auction for literacy programs. We were all people who had come to art later in life, who had discovered creativity after decades of focusing on other people's needs and expectations. We understood each other's journey from invisible to visible, from useful to valued, from sacrificial to whole. As I shaped the clay with my hands, I thought about the version of myself who had existed just 18 months earlier. The woman who wore tattered clothes and counted subway fare and believed her worth was measured by how much she could give away. She seemed like a character from someone else's story now, someone I had known briefly but hadn't really understood. This Elena, the one with clay under her fingernails and plans for a weekend art retreat and dinner reservations with friends who valued her company, felt like the person I had always been meant to become. Age hadn't diminished me. It had refined me, stripped away everything that wasn't essential, and revealed the strong, creative, independent woman who had been waiting underneath layers of self-sacrifice and accommodation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Mom, Tommy is applying for colleges and wants to include you in the process. He specifically asked if his grandmother who makes pottery could help him think about his essay topics. Are you free this weekend to spend some time with him?" The request made me smile. Tommy no longer saw me as a source of emergency funds or free babysitting. He saw me as an interesting adult with experiences and perspectives that might be valuable to him as he made important decisions about his future. He wanted my guidance, not my checkbook. I texted back, "I would love to help Tommy with his college essays. Let's plan a whole afternoon so we can really dive into the topics he's considering." Another message came from Michael. Mom Jennifer and I are thinking about taking that pottery class you recommended. Would you be willing to be our teacher's assistant? We'd love to learn from someone whose work we admire. The messages were coming from family members who saw me as a complete person with skills, interests, and value that extended far beyond my usefulness in crisis situations. They were inviting me to share my knowledge and creativity rather than demanding that I solve their problems or fund their emergencies. This was what healthy family relationships looked like. Mutual respect, genuine interest, voluntary participation in each other's lives based on affection rather than obligation. I had spent months fearing that setting boundaries would cost me my family connections. Instead, it had transformed those connections into something deeper and more satisfying than I had ever experienced. As the sun set through the studio windows, casting golden light across our various projects, I felt a sense of completeness that surprised me with its intensity. I wasn't just surviving my later years, I was thriving in them. I wasn't just existing, I was living with purpose and passion and genuine joy. The money I had hidden from myself for so many years had given me options and independence. But the emotional growth I had achieved by learning to value myself had given me something even more precious: the courage to claim the life I actually wanted, rather than settling for the life others expected me to accept. I finished the bowl I was working on and held it up to catch the last light from the window. It was beautiful, imperfect, clearly handmade, obviously the work of someone still learning her craft. But it was mine. I had created it with my own hands, my own vision, my own skill and determination. Just like the life I was living now. Beautiful, imperfect, clearly crafted by someone who had taken her time learning how to be herself. But it was mine, finally and completely mine. And that made all the difference in the world. Looking back now, I can see that pretending to be broke for all those years wasn't really about money at all. It was about fear. Fear that if people knew I didn't need them, they wouldn't choose to want me. Fear that my value as a person was tied to my usefulness as a resource. Fear that love was something I had to earn, rather than something I deserved simply by existing. Those fears had kept me smaller than I needed to be, poorer than I was, lonelier than was necessary. They had convinced me to live as a victim when I could have been living as a victor all along. But transformation is possible at any age. Dignity can be reclaimed even after decades of abandonment. Independence can be claimed even after years of dependence. Love can be redefined even after a lifetime of misunderstanding what it means. I spent 72 years learning those lessons. But I still have time to live them. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered if the people who claim to love you would still be interested in a relationship if you stopped being useful to them? Have you ever sacrificed your own well-being to solve problems that weren't yours to solve? If any of this sounds familiar, I want you to know that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, your independence, and your right to be valued for who you are, rather than what you can provide. Share your story in the comments if you feel moved to do so. And if this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps me continue opening my heart and sharing these difficult but necessary truths about family, independence, and the courage it takes to finally put yourself first. The best years of your life might still be waiting for you to discover them.